Hi everyone, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. If you're watching it on the internet or listening to a podcast version of the show, make sure to subscribe so that you get notified when a new show is released. And if you'd like to find links to videos or MP3 files, just go to miamighostchronicles.com, and you can also submit any eerie experiences you've had at the Submit Your Story tab. Also, hook up with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find information not only about new shows, but also about monthly free merchandise giveaways. So get comfortable, enjoy this new episode, and just imagine it's a dark and stormy night where not a creature is stirring, not even a mouse. And if a creature is stirring, you hope it's a mouse. Hi everybody, it's Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How's everybody doing? And today I am super excited with the guest that we're going to be talking to. First of all, this is a lady who is interested and is active in a lot of different fields in the paranormal. And by this I mean, and you know I've mentioned it several times before, that the paranormal, everybody thinks sometimes of the paranormal as just being ghost stuff, and not at all. That's just one of the things. There's so many other things that could fall under that umbrella. And her name is Susan Demeter St. Clair. She's a Canadian-based anomalies researcher and writer. Now, her research and her interests are an eclectic mix and include such diverse subjects as parapsychology, parasociology, social PSI, frontier science anomalies, unidentified aerial phenomena, Western esoteric knowledge and philosophy, chaos, magic, folklore, and synchronicity, among other areas. So there's a lot to talk to her about, but you know that the first thing I'm going to ask her about is, after I welcome her, how are you doing today, Sue?
Oh, I'm great. I'm so happy to be talking to you
No.
today
Um,
too. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction.
on the contrary, it is my pleasure. And my audience knows that I always ask all my guests, how did you become involved in this field? Was it childhood interest and experience or something that you got involved in as an adult?
As a serious sort of researcher, it obviously was more of an adult. It was a choice that I had made to pursue as an adult, based more on childhood, I guess, experiences where I feel it sort of chose me versus me sort of choosing it, so to speak.
Okay.
I did have a bunch of experiences as a child that at the time I sort of related to the lens of a child and perhaps pop culture and sort of family beliefs, the sort of ghost experiences. But later on, as an adult, they sort of took on more the narrative of a UFO experience. So
Okay.
I sort of started off as sort of exploring UFOs and getting into ghosts, and it just like snowballed from there for me anyway. I just love all these topics.
Okay. And that's, I tell everybody sometimes wants to put the paranormal as like one thing or the other. And even though some of them are quite separate, they all have that, I want to say sometimes they fall under that umbrella of sometimes not having sharp linear edges as far as reproduction, reproduction as far as in the lab, for example, or proof. And, sometimes there's a headbutting with hard science. So, um, and have you had any close encounter? Have you ever seen a UFO?
I have had three UFO experiences that were quite dramatic, and they sort of occurred for me. I am now calling them more UFO initiation.
Okay.
First one was I was 23 years old at the time, and I had been at the time I had two small children, and I had put them to bed, and I was living in this sort of 10th floor condominium overlooking Lake Ontario at that time, and I was up late and I was watching I'll never forget this Elvira's Mistress of the Dark film.
Ah,
Uh,
I remember that.
so
Yes.
it was November 4th. It was just after like that Halloween, and I was still in that sort of mode. And I was watching this film with my then brother-in-law, and as it was my habit, because I lived on this 10th floor condominium, I had these sliding glass doors out onto this patio,
Okay.
and I had a lock in my husband at that time, put these extra locks on it to make sure the kids could never get out on the balcony. And so I went to go and lock them, and I saw this huge glowing red sort of ball of light through the glass doors. And I remember looking back towards the television set, which this film was just, the Elvira was just ending, thinking it, just a reflection. What is this? And
Right.
then I realized it was something outside. And I went and I opened the door and I went out, and I was wearing my pajamas at the time. It was very late. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I noticed this huge, it was almost like octagonal red shaped pulsing orb. And I remember staring at it for probably maybe 30 seconds or so. And I yelled out to my brother-in-law, who had stayed up to watch this film with me. And he came out, and we were looking at this, and we were kind of freaking out, like, what the heck is
Yeah.
this? Any sound? And it was near in the vicinity of the Pickering nuclear generating station. So it was over this nuclear power plant. It was over the lake. We were looking at this thing, and at some point, my brother-in-law said to me, "I think we're seeing a UFO." And
Okay.
honestly, I couldn't argue with him, and it was so incredible. And I remember saying to him very cryptically, and this came back to me later in memory. I didn't remember saying it right away, but I said, "They know we can see them." And then at that point, this thing to me seemed to implode on itself, this big ball of glowing light in the sky, and it shot straight up and it was gone.
Wow.
And I remember staying up all night. Like, I didn't sleep at all that night. We were up talking. What
I
was this?
bet.
It was both of us. And this was pre-internet days, so I couldn't just jump on Google or look up Twitter or see if anyone else had seen something. So
Right.
I looked at the newspapers of the following day, and I couldn't see anything. And I remember thinking to myself, we couldn't have been alone seeing this.
Exactly.
But then I didn't really know who to turn to. So I ended up going to the library because I wasn't really into UFOs at that point. I remember I thought I had all these ghostly experiences as a child. I never kind of connected the two. And I found a UFO book which I took out, and it sort of started me down the road from there, as far as trying to research what this could have been, which eventually got me involved in some UFO community and groups like MUFON and that, which were
Okay.
investigating things at the time. So it sort of started from that point forward. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. So, and that I view that now as sort of an initiation experience. I've
Let me
had
tell you
enough.
something. That's quite an initiation because a lot of people, they're like kind of like they that, and it's really interesting what you say because your first thought is you're thinking of something plausible, like something like, is it a reflection? And you're not thinking UFO. You're thinking what's causing this, and also
Yes,
what you mentioned is you're thinking the next day. Why are people running around the street saying, "Hey, what is that?" And sometimes not everybody. There's like sometimes there's coverage. I want to say now there seems to be more coverage of things like that, but back then and it was
yes,
like it would go unreported.
it would. And a lot of people didn't know who to turn to. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't know, anything really about the subject prior to then, or that there was this grassroots movement, such as with QFOS or with MUFON. I did find a book by Dr. Alan Hynek, who was very prominent in the field and was part of Project Blue Book. I don't know how much you know about UFOs, but some
Right.
of your audience may, some of the listeners may know what I'm talking about. And I found that he had unfortunately passed away, but I wrote this entire letter out, a handwritten letter, going back to 1990.
Okay.
And unfortunately, it came back returned to sender because it was, he had passed away, and the address
Oh.
for in the back of the book was gone. So I kept that with me until my kids were much older, and then it was in the early days of the internet, so about 96, 97. In there, I started to look for UFOs on the internet, but
Okay.
the internet, and this is where I started finding other people and other researchers, and I was, oh, hey, there are these people on there, some really intelligent people out there that are
Yes.
looking into this, and this is really cool. And so again, that's how it all kind of started for me. Um, and then I began sort of as well looking into spook lights, which are sort of anomaly lights that were occurring here in Ontario. And
Okay.
it was occurring in a place called the Ghost Road. So this sort of brought me into that ghostly realm. And I started drawing parallels between ghosts and UFOs at that point, and other
Okay.
sort of spooky Fortean topics. They actually have a lot in common.
Right. And I know some people, and I guess whether you want to think of it as the internet or more people being more, out front about their experiences. But, I know there's people that track correlations between UFO sightings, sightings of cryptids, other unusual phenomena. Like there's an uptick all around the same time or sometimes the same location.
Yes, and sometimes it will start off like for me, I felt that I had grown up in a haunted house. I had experiences with sort of these little people that I
Wow.
had figured were ghosts. I come from a family where my mother saw ghosts. My grandmother did as well. After
Right.
I had my UFO experience, and my father was a pilot, and he at different points worked for the Department of National Defense, and he saw UFOs in the Gulf of Mexico in the 1950s. And I didn't know that until I told him what happened to me at age 23. I was like, Dad, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I think I saw a UFO. And he was, no, I believe that there's something to this. I saw something similar
Wow.
many years ago. So I've come from that family background where it was sort of open to discuss these things.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, I do think that sometimes people will have ghostly experiences and then later go on to have like sort of these larger experiences in the sky, or it can be vice versa. They will have like a some strange UFO anomaly in the sky type thing, and then they'll start having poltergeist experiences in their
Hmm.
home.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there seems to be some dovetailing between the two. I know there are some people that really want to keep it separate, like, oh, people who believe in ghosts, well, they're the crazy people, but obviously
Right.
aliens are true. And then there are other people who are like, oh, like we don't want anything to do with these alien nonsense, but obviously ghosts are true. So I mean, like I know there's some that would like to keep the topic separate, but I do see them as sort of there are when you start removing the narrative of what they could be and just looking at the mechanics behind things. Ghosts have been seen to they apparently go through walls. UFO occupants or pilots have been described going through walls. Um, People tend to have UFO experiences in very liminal sort of places, isolated country roads and crossroads,
Yes.
things like that. People tend to see ghosts in very liminal spaces, in staircases, at windows, in doorways, things of that nature. When you start looking at that and even examining more symbolic content between the two sort of experiences, there is a lot they have in common. So I'm not saying they are the same thing, but it's something you can't ignore, you know, in my opinion.
Well, and I belong to MUFON, and I also belong to a group down here in South Florida that, you know, people get together. Everybody's, it's about UFOs, of course, and things of that nature. And afterwards, people will talk, and there's a good portion of people that, after they had some type of encounter or sighting, for them with UFOs, it's almost like they describe to me where things got peculiar in their lives sometimes, as far as feelings, and I'm not even talking alien visitation or abduction. Just that I want to say like their life got, especially at night, like a paranormal feel to it. Whether sometimes they had never had ghostly encounters, they started seeing, sensing things. It was like the before and the after of the UFO sighting was the demarcation.
Yes, it's like all of a sudden the floodgates of weirdness open,
Yes,
and
yes,
then and some people do go on to have many experiences afterwards. And even with the experiences themselves, I'm very interested in people who have sort of what I would term the high strangeness.
right.
And that would be experiences with UFOs where there is telepathy, where there is a seeming sort of ESP or um, anything that sort of denotes a crossover into the paranormal versus just the nuts and bolts sighting of a spaceship or a strange light in the sky.
Right. Exactly. And that's the thing that for a lot of these people, because I know there's ufologists out there that, like you said, they're into the nuts and bolts. What did it look like? What was the angle that it went? Yeah. And that's it. That event is really what they're interested in. Period. Whatever you saw or whatever, or in some cases, if you're lucky enough to be able to have taken a picture of it. But I think there's like I said, more than one person has described that that's happened to them. Um, where there's, and then you think to yourself, okay, was it something around you that was there all along? Did something shift in your brain that now you're more aware of these things? Like what happens to you that
Well,
allows you to do that or see that?
yeah, and that I think is where some of ufology has really dropped the ball in just sort of chasing the idea of the ETH and the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and just a really nuts and bolts sort of tell me, about the craft or tell me about this, as opposed to focusing on the witnesses. And then also trying to kind of bring this type of respectability to the subject where people are genuinely afraid to give the full story. And I
Yes.
find more that this, when I go out into the field and I like to talk to people one on one in person as opposed to just internet or telephone, then when you're sitting with someone and having a cup of coffee and I try to break the ice with people, then they'll start telling me more, and the experience becomes richer. Like they know that that there might be things, then they'll preface it with, I saw this da 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 in the sky. Please don't think I'm a crazy person, but then this happened. And that the
Right.
strange thing might be they saw, I saw this thing, and then I ended up on pulling into my driveway, and there was a strange rabbit that was plaid, and it
Yes.
kind of hopped away. And they don't want to say it, and obviously in some cases with real nuts and bolts people, they don't even want to hear it, or they
Oh
won't include
no.
that in what they're examining. But I think that is the key, these little bits of high strangeness. Seeing owls. Owls tend to play a part in this as well. People will have strange experiences with owls. And
Really?
such. Yeah. Um, my friend Mike Cullen has written a book on this, which is Messengers, and in regards to people that are having experiences with owls. At the time, they're also having UFO experiences.
Interesting.
And I mean, these are things that nuts and bolts people might want to put aside, but to me, they are interesting little nuggets of information that when we take
Mm-hmm.
these in, they might provide clues. I look at these as almost symbolic in content, perhaps, and as well, like looking at the witness and what they may be going on, what's going on in their lives at the time, much like you would in parapsychology with a poltergeist person on the focus of a poltergeist. You're going to look at the person and what's going on with them, as opposed to just the events that are happening around them. And that might give us some more clues as to, or at least open up more questions than just the standard nuts and bolts sort of investigation hat.
Yeah, it's exactly because they do kind of like the Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. Only the facts. And it's like, okay, well, you know what? There's a lot of times what I say is like, it's not maybe only what you saw, is how do you feel? What did you feel? Uh,
Yeah.
versus sometimes even what you thought, you know, two different things. Two different things. You could be thinking one thing but feeling another. Um, and and I know and this has to do a lot that I've discussed this with other people that that we a lot of times we think of UFOs and extraterrestrials and etc. as visiting us from outer space, as in some type of spaceship. How they do it, who knows? But then we discuss what if they're traveling interdimensionally, and this also accounts for sightings of cryptids. Is there a portal? Is there a rip? Are they coming through and some things are hopping through when they open up to come into our I mean, it doesn't have
It's
to be just a space linear concept of travel.
exactly. And I think in my own personal view, it was something that I sort of latched on to very early on, with that sort of nuts and bolts ETH sort of look at UFOs, because really there wasn't anything else, and there wasn't the internet. And I was very, it was such a shock to me. But over time, I sort of evolved my views to move away from the ETH. I mean, it still could be something that's alien or extraterrestrial. But in my opinion, whatever it is occurring on Earth, it's occurring to human beings and sometimes animals.
Mm-hmm.
We should be focusing more on that. It may not be alien at all. Recently, I just came back from a trip to Italy where I was doing research on a group of witches from the Middle Ages that were having experiences that are similar in some ways to the modern teaching.
Really?
Yes, and also involve light in the sky. But I came across an interesting sort of report. It was very well documented by the Catholic Church at the time. And it was around the 11th century, where multiple witnesses saw this large dragon, and they describe it as as a dragon in the sky. And apparently, it had been terrorizing this town, and they managed to knock this dragon out down from the sky. And I'm assuming they killed it, but that part I'm not clear on. But when you start breaking down the idea that these are people living, in medieval
Yes.
times, and we're talking about a flying dragon, it starts taking on very much the same narrative of a UFO shoot
Sure.
down, of a UFO crash. So I
Exactly.
used to think that people were maybe mistaking spaceships for and just using the language of their time to describe things. But I really
Exactly.
I've changed my mind though on that. I now think these people were describing exactly what they were seeing, but it's
Right.
phenomena itself that has changed its form. A spaceship is more palatable to a 21st century world that is oriented towards, space travel and space exploration. People today, you can talk to people. The majority of people on the street will probably tell you that they believe in aliens or the possibility of life outside of this planet ahead of, say, angels or dragons or things of that nature. So I have to wonder if perhaps it is the phenomena that's changed how we perceive it through our human lenses as just these people back in time making a misperception. Like I'm just speculating, but it's this type of trying to turn things around in our minds and perhaps ask different questions that might, move these sort of studies forward. At least I think so.
And you also have to think that, let's say, let's go to like to that example that you gave, medieval times. Anything secular was you could, the next thing you know, you're burning at the stake as a heretic. So what if these people were couching it in the safest way possible, that the church would say, okay, because can you imagine you're describing something that is really, really, truly otherworldly, you know? So it's like, okay, we
Yes.
saw something, let's just call it a dragon, and that way it'll be safe. And, the church will say, oh, maybe from the devil, or say, because back then everything had to be, if you wanted to stay on the right side of that, you didn't want to stray too far from something that like you said, that the Catholic religion could say, oh, okay, we know what that is, that's a dragon, and God knows what interpretation they gave. I don't know if you ever, if they just documented it or gave any explanation to the people that lived there, but it was a safe interpretation. Maybe there were people there looking at this thing and going, what in the, in other words, they knew perfectly well that it wasn't a dragon, but
Well, exactly. I mean, that is a possible scenario. It's also possible that they were experiencing it because they were pulling from their own sort of knowledge and their
oh
own sort
yeah,
of
of course, like another, exactly, if you see something, and let's face it, back then maybe the closest, and I imagine back in medieval times, your general population did not have access to books, or were literate for that fact. So then maybe they just heard about a dragon that spits out, what's the characteristics of a dragon that flies around and eats people
exactly.
and maybe breathes fire, whatever. And like you said, maybe this is like, okay, it's flying, it's weird. Oh, that must be a dragon, so that's very possible.
Exactly. So, I mean, in my opinion, the one thing that we can, as researchers, that we can agree on is the fact that these experiences have been occurring at least since written record of humanity. Like People have been describing ghosts. People have been describing UFO type experiences and other sorts of strange, sort of crypto-like things. I mean, and speaking of the cryptos, they too, with Bigfoot, I was talking with my friend Josh Clifton, who contributed to a volume, I think it was called With Not, about Bigfoot. And he was drawing parallels between Bigfoot and poltergeists, the strange smells that are produced by Bigfoot, the knocks that you hear in that are associated with them, like you hear these strange knocks, like raps. That's something that you also find in poltergeist cases, these strange raps. So there's evidence there to sort of say maybe there's some correlation as well. And he actually calls Bigfoot sort of like the poltergeist of the forest.
Yeah.
So,
Why not?
why not? So I mean, there are these. They may or may not be related. But when you start, again, stripping away the storyline that's identifying and just looking at these sorts of things that people are describing, would not, strange smells, these type things, they also occur with UFOs.
Yes.
People describe the pilots of UFOs as smelling almost sulfuric, almost demonic.
Really?
And they behave sometimes in ways that people would describe as demons or demonic, and that they behave almost like an old pig, where there's pressure on the chest, and there's sort of sexual interference, and all these sorts of things that you can go back in time and say, hey, if you just remove the word demon and insert alien, it sounds similar. Or, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yes, exactly. Like that, if you weren't looking at, it's more the description of the experience versus what's actually causing it. They're very similar.
Mhm.
And this is and I want to say that I guess there's two types of experiences along those lines. I want to say there's like a very impersonal one, which is where you see something, for example, whether it's the light or whatever, and
Mhm.
that's it. That's the extent of it. That's all that happens. You wig out because, of course, after you check off all the plausible stuff, you know that this is something that doesn't belong there. But that's the end of it. But then there's other people that it just, then you go into the persons that then they uh, have abduction, either recall of abductions or visitations at night. Uh, like in other words, their life is meshed up into that UFO ET experience. And like I say, okay, you know what? Okay, let's say you do have somebody who's not well, has mental illness, and they describe this, and I'm sure that that accounts for some. But there's too many people describing or recalling experiences like that, sometimes since childhood, for them all of them to be, uh, you know, yeah, having a hallucination or anything like that.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I think that is really a lazy sort of interpretation from certain skeptical quarters, which are not even really being skeptical because they're not questioning; they're auto denying.
right.
And so mental illness is thrown out, mass hallucination is often thrown out, things that are mass hysteria and different things. And often I actually chuckle at some of this stuff because it really doesn't fit what people are experiencing and what they're saying. It's the same with the UFOs. People will try to, explain away other people's experiences as if they're like, they're stupid, like they don't know what a plane looks like. I mean, we've had aviation now for more than 100 years.
Exactly.
Most people know when they look up in the sky what a plane is. There's a difference between a plane and something
Mm-hmm.
very strange and anomalous. The thing is that all these subjects they're very subjective experiences. So it's best, I think, in my opinion, to sort of examine the one tangible component of all of it, and that is the human being a part of the story. Because a human being has had some very strange experience, and they're describing it the best they can through a very human lens.
Sure.
Um, and
Sure.
that to me is the most interesting thing. So I like to tell people that when you're telling me your experience, there's no judgment there. I don't care how wild and your story seems to sound or how you feel. I feel that it is that those absurd details, those little details that just make the whole thing absurd, that may be the key to helping us unlock some of this. those really absurd little things that happen that people tend to shy away. You know,
Right.
like they'll happy to say the basic story, but then when they get to that little point of very high strangeness, they try to hold back because I can't count how many times people have said to me, please don't judge me, please don't think I'm crazy. And I genuinely feel bad because, you know, people shouldn't have to feel that way. They're describing exactly what they've experienced. And in doing this now for more than 20 years, I would say the vast majority of people are honest and they're
Yes.
not embellishing and they're not,
Exactly.
they just need somebody to say, you know what, yeah, that's weird. I can't answer any of these questions. I always tell people I'll never be able to give you 100% foolproof answer. I don't know what these things are, but I do know they exist. I do know they happen to people, and it's across the board. You know, crazy people don't question their sanity. They don't.
Right, exactly. And lots of times when these people have these experiences, they themselves are trying to they're wanting to find a rational explanation for it. They're like
Yeah,
really trying to find like something that I can say, oh, okay, it's okay, you know, it's like, oh, it's a whatever.
yeah,
Before they come up against the wall and realize, oh, none of that fits. So what's left is this other explanation that this isn't a UFO, whatever the case might be. You know, depending also what where people live, if it's a rural or an urban area, and I tell people like, you know, a lot of these sightings of whether there were extraterrestrials or UFOs from ancient times or earlier times, you know, people don't realize back then there was something like this would be very visible. There was not a lot of the artificial lighting that we have, let's say in the night sky, for example,
yeah,
where anything that you would see back then, you would notice it. You would see it. It would be very difficult not to see it. So when they describe certain things certain ways, it's not like, okay, I'm confusing it with what? There was nothing there. There was no airplanes. There was no artificial lighting. The skies were very dark.
yeah.
Uh, and you had just basically starlight and maybe moonlight if the moon was out, depending on, you know, where it was at. But that was about it. So when things people saw this, especially at night, they had a pretty clear view of what they were seeing and what they were describing.
Yes, and they were describing, I believe, exactly what they were seeing. At least that's what my sort of working sort of idea is going with what people were seeing back then, how they were describing, how they were using art and that to explore these ideas of the sacred and their experiences with these types of strange anomalies. Um, and it is true. Like today, people tend to be very distracted. They
Right.
tend to, be more looking at their phone than say the night sky.
Yes.
So I often wonder as well, has the sort of phenomena itself sort of changed itself in its behavior? Like now we see a lot of shadow people. Shadow
Yes.
people are often reported. But if you look back to the literature, like through this Society of Psychical Research and other literature going back pre-internet days, pre-computers and that, you really don't see much. You might get like a shadowy mask
Right.
or something like that, but now we have like fully formed sort of shadow beings. And I often wonder if this has something to do with the age that we're living in, like the information age. And I'll try to bring my ideas out so that they make some sort
Okay.
of sense, I hope. But I'm kind of thinking that perhaps because the shadow people really have no discernible features. Sometimes we could maybe guess at their gender, but beyond that, they don't really have discernible features. They're shadowy, they're 2D almost. Um,
Right.
is this a reflection of more the way we are relating towards other human beings through the internet, which is very two-dimensional? Is this sort of now the phenomena itself sort of gaining our attention, so to speak, or displaying itself in the way that we're sort of living in the modern age? This is just a thought that I'm throwing out there. I could be completely
Right.
wrong.
Right. I know what you're saying, and I know exactly what you mean. Like all of a sudden, this is becomes everybody has had this experience, but if, like you said, prior to a certain time period, it like was relatively unheard of.
Yeah, I
And
mean there's always exceptions to these rules. I'm sure that somebody out there might say, "Hey, but I found this," and they're using a text from like 1800. But for the vast majority, no. It's like pre sort of 1980s. You really don't see shadow people being talked about. People were describing ghosts in a different way. And
right,
now the majority of reports and things that I'm seeing are more oriented towards the shadow.
right.
So I just find
It's
that.
almost like they're well, and I'm going to give you an example. And I tell this is back like you said, pre-advent of the internet. This was back that like during the late 1980s. And I had a
Mhm,
coworker of mine, and I was in my 20s, and she was a little bit younger, and she starts telling me now she lived in a two-bedroom apartment. Well, by the time we were having this conversation, her mom had passed away, but with her dad, and this is like in the suburb of Miami, very modern setting, in other words.
mhm.
And we were talking about ghosts and stuff like that, and she tells me how when she's a teenager in her bedroom one day, she wakes up. And this is in relations to one of these phenomena that they call Hat Man, which sometimes
Yeah,
goes hand in hand with a Shadow Man.
yeah.
So she's telling me how one day she wakes up and she sees at the foot of her bed the equivalent of almost like a shadow man, but he has a top hat on. And I remember looking at her going, he had a what on? Like, where was he going to the opera? A top hat? Like, it was, I've never forgotten it just because her description was so out of place. And obviously, she did not know. She says
About
that when she woke up, she says that it was such a horrible feeling of dread that it was, she says she just covered, like a lot of people do, she just covered her head up and
oh,
she
I
started
would too.
praying, like, and as a matter of fact, like within a year, her mom passed away. Her mom had a heart condition. Her mom passed away and everything. And I remember this because, like you said, later on when this thing came on, like Shadow Man and then Hat Man, I was like, wait a minute, she's telling me this story back in the 1980s because it was such a weird event, and of all things, to have a man or like a type of Shadow Man with a top hat. It's like of all the
Yeah,
things that you would think that she would see, that would be it.
exactly. That is a strange one.
Yes.
I did one of the first ghost investigations I did back in the 90s. Was at a hotel, and a very haunted hotel here in the Toronto area called the Guild Inn. At the time, was still operational, and now it's semi-operational. It was shut down for many years, and it was left in a very decrepit state. But just before, prior to that, I was able to get in there. It was a historic hotel um, overlooking Lake Ontario, so very picturesque. A lot of art in that, and it's set in this woods, and it's sort of very ambient sort of place. But the hotel was haunted, and the thing that interested me the most was this experience of a young sous chef who was apprenticing that summer. And the hotel, because of its beautiful grounds, was host to many weddings. And the chef, his experience that he was saying, he was in the kitchens one day and he was chopping vegetables when this man walks in from a side door and he's in a full sort of like dark black suit with this large sort of, and he described it as an Abraham Lincoln top hat. And
Okay.
I thought, okay, well that's odd.
Uh-huh.
And then he said that at first he was like, why is this person here? And then he thought, well, maybe it was a wedding guest or someone from a wedding party that had accidentally come in the staff area in the kitchen area, and he, no, you can't really be in here. No, you're gonna have to go away. So this man apparently walked through this open door, walked through the entire kitchen area, negotiating all these counters with his vegetables and prep stuff with. And he said what really tweaked him out is that as he watched this man and he was going to say, hey, you can't be in this area, he seemingly walked through a closed door.
Oh.
This chef was just totally floored. And he said it took him about a minute to just sort of recover himself. And he went out, he opened this door, he went running out into this hallway towards this reception area of this hotel, looking for where is this person. And he asked at the time, the person who was working at the reception desk, had you seen this man, this tall man, walk by with this big, Abraham Lincoln top hat? And she was saying no. And he swore that there was no way that anyone could get in and out of that area without walking past the reception area. So he had assumed it was one of the hotel's many ghosts. And he was so unnerved by the experience. He was only apprenticing there for a summer that he managed to do a few more shifts, and then he quit his job. He left.
I
It,
don't,
it unnerved him that much, but it
yeah.
wasn't until a few years after that had been sort of investigated, that hotel, and it had closed down, and that this idea of this hat man sprung up all over the internet. And I always wondered if perhaps what this man saw was somehow related to that. But I have also talked to other people who have seen sort of hat men, stick men, and things like that that seem to be an internet phenomenon. But
Right.
they there are always examples of these types of things pre to that. So I have to wonder if it's somehow related, or, in the case that you were describing, if it was maybe some sort of a harbinger, or more of an archetype than a spirit or something like that.
Right.
Sort of,
Which even when you think about it, it's like, I, it's like okay, because it's almost like, and I know what you're saying. It's like you would think something like this if it would have been seen, even let's say pre-internet, turn of the century, there would have been somebody saying, writing a story about describing that ghost that looked like a whatever, and
yeah, and they seem to there seem to be some that follow this sort of archetype of, you have a lot of women in black, women in
right,
white, women in green, sort of
right,
apparitions, or sort of these specific type of apparitions. And then there are other ones that you really don't have. Like, I don't think I've come across any modern sort of chain rattling ghosts that you
no,
kind of
right,
read about in
right,
or
exactly, yeah,
Renaissance.
like,
Yeah, yeah, the texts of that era that sort of, um, describe that sort of thing. You don't really see them anymore in the
well,
modern day and age.
if you remember, like, earlier this, well, turn of this, well, not this century, I forget, but turn of the century, with spiritualism, where all these psychics would have to were producing ectoplasm out of different places in their bodies, and it was like this was the norm when you were doing some type of spirit contact. And I was thinking, man, that's that stopped, in other words. But that was like part of the proof that you were having some type of like that this was a real psychic event or a contact with the dead, was that they could produce ectoplasm.
Yes, and that is sort of, when you look at that, there were so many at the time that were sort of busted as hoaxes, and
Yes.
that it was a form of trickery, like that they were used. But then there are other cases that are not so easy to sort of debunk or put aside. And there is a sort of tradition, almost a magical tradition behind that, in the trickery, where you can have these sorts of characters that we're doing, like some of these physical mediums, where yes, there was hostry involved, but there was also real psychic things happening around them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with, for instance, Madame Blavatsky and others of that era, that yes, there some of the things you can look at and think, okay, there's some chicanery going on here, but perhaps from that chicanery itself springs forth some of this magic, or some of these psychic things that do happen that make you scratch your head and go, wait a second. So we can debunk some of this, but other stuff is not so easily explained. And that is true even of shamanic practices and shaman going back to ancient times, where you have sort of this idea of trickery, or this trickster like aspect of,
Right.
of this particular practitioner, or in a medium or psychic medium that may be producing ectoplasm, but also having strange other things like affords and things also occurring that are not so easily written off or explained away. Yeah.
Well, and I kind of have a theory on this, and this is what I tell everybody, because the supernatural is not an on-demand event, just like if you're psychic or you have mediumship abilities. And let's say you were one of these people that were paying your bills. Let's say
Mhm.
you were holding seances and you were paying your bills. You might really have been a legitimate psychic or a medium, but maybe it was not something that you could do every day, or on certain days you were just not feeling well. But here you are, you got to pay your bills, you got to keep a roof over your head. So maybe there were times that people, they fell back onto, like you said, tricks. But that
Well,
didn't
yeah,
mean that they weren't real. It's just like there were human beings where it was like, I'm tired, or I just can't do this today, or I feel sick. But I've got a room full of people expecting some type of spirit communication.
well, yeah, and the thing too is that it's not necessarily like I think that it is actually part of the phenomena itself because when you look at some of the poltergeist focuses as well,
Mm-hmm.
um, going back in time, there was a famous parapsychologist, Nandor Fodor, and he wrote extensively about how these people would have genuine sort of these sometimes very frightening psychic type experiences as poltergeists. And then later they would go on to hoax. And in some cases, he thought they didn't even realize they were hoaxing. They were just doing it almost by rote. So
Okay.
there's like reams of sort of psychological reasons as to why that might be. But I think that in fact, the entire, all these sort of paranormal subjects have sort of tricksterish like things about them. There's a book called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, and I highly, highly recommend it to
Okay.
anybody who's ghosts or into psychic or into UFOs. It's a very sort of heavy, it's a magnum sort of this book, but it gets into all these subjects, and he really has done a lot of research, including into skeptics and how
Yes.
they too produce trickery. James Randi was known for fudging his numbers. There was this famous case where, like, he had this break with Cyclops because he literally cooked the books more or less to see
Right.
his $1 million prize. It is designed never to be won, and he knew that. Okay, like he knows. Um,
Yes.
so I mean, there's trickery there as well. So it's a very interesting book to say that this these experiences are real. They do happen to people. People have experienced those. People
Yes.
experience those. But there's this trickery that's also when you start examining people that have these experiences, when you start examining professional sort of psychics and things like that, there is always that trickster element, that pixie-ishness that seems to be running through all of this as well. You know,
Right.
I
Exactly.
mean,
And let me tell you that I want to say, like, in part of what you're saying, the human, our egos. Let's say if you have some type of fame attached to your name, that, let's say, well, like you said, Harry Price, when he was doing the investigation of Borley Rectory,
yes.
and you're supposed to be preeminent, and hey, if you're investigating, it's like, watch out. Can you imagine, you walk away and say, I didn't, nothing happened? you know
Well, that's true. And that's the thing. None of these things happen on cue. This is why
Right.
we can't, like they have a lot of wonderful work in the Care Labs on parapsychology and the Rhine Institute and that lab work. But overall, these things are very spontaneous. They just don't happen on cue. So
Yes.
there is always that sort of spontaneous, tricksterish, sort of pixie type thing that surrounds all of these sort of things. You never hear of somebody who actually wills the ghost and the ghost appears. It's
Yes.
always at some strange moment where you're not expecting it and the camera's not handy
Oh
or
God, that is very common.
or the recorder's not, handy. Like there's a famous sort of poltergeist case that I remember from Britain. John and Ann Spencer had investigated it, where they had this whole house wired up with recording equipment, and they had the people out, they had the house sealed, and lots of physical phenomena had been occurring there. They get into the house about 5 minutes after because we were going back into the days of analog, so we had these, flip tapes and things like that. They come in and there's this large, heavy ceramic duck that had been on the fireplace, and it was now sitting in the middle of the floor.
Wow.
So, but you know what? The tapes never caught it because the camera had stopped, and
Mm-hmm.
so they figured that within that 5 minute window of them, the cameras stopping and then them going to go and flip tapes and do what they had to do, this is when the strange thing occurred. It's almost as if there's that cheeky sort of
Yes.
tricksterish, like, ha ha ha, this
Right.
is, you're trying to catch some proof as far as photographs are concerned, and it's not going to happen. You
Yes.
know,
Well,
or
you know
maybe
what? There's been more than
right?
one paranormal team who, like you said, that they've rolled out all the stuff that I was going to call it something, all the equipment that they have nowadays for, and nothing happens or very. And as soon as they start breaking stuff down, like just like you said, stuff is disconnected and turned off. Then they hear
Yes,
like with their own ears, it's like, oh my god, they'll hear footsteps, some type of phenomena. They're like, what? And it's like, okay, exactly like what you said. Now I know that there's like, ha ha ha. Guess who has the
exactly.
last laugh?
Exactly. It's like it's the same thing as people trying to collect EVP. It always seems to either come in bisecting somebody's conversation, or after something happens, after the cameras are put away or the equipment's packed away and people are, having their coffee and chit chatting, and that's when something happens. And it's funny because I think as well of the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah,
Mm-hmm.
um, where the billionaire Robert Bigelow had spent a lot of money with Mint. He hired some of the best scientists in the country. They had all this top end equipment, and they were, day and night trying to record things in this ranch that has had some very, very strange and often frightening uh,
Yes.
paranormal phenomena. And yet, none of these scientists were ever able to get any concrete evidence.
Right.
Oh, but yet many of them went on to have very frightening sort of experiences, like seeing sort of like these balls of light with these strange sort of beings seemingly coming from the ball of light, and cattle mutilations and other strange, really bizarre things going on there. And yet, with all this heavy duty scientific stuff, they weren't able to. It's almost as if it's one step ahead, or it's sort of goosing you, like, haha, you can have all this, but you're not going to catch me.
Let me ask you. Now that you
I,
mentioned,
I'm not,
now that you brought up Skinwalker Ranch, the last thing I heard, and I haven't kept up with it lately, was that they had basically stopped bringing in teams because a lot of the phenomena had moved away. Like it had stopped, kind of, and they were hoping that by closing it down, in other words, and not allowing people to run around trying to capture evidence, that whatever phenomena was there would start returning. Uh,
yeah, and I think that it's under someone new owns it now. It is private property,
right.
um, so people can't just come up and visit.
Yes.
But I mean, it is under new sort of ownership, and my what I sort of heard is that things are going on there still,
Okay.
but the scientific sort of side of it, I don't know if it's still that's going on. But I do know that a lot of what was published by Bigelow's team and NID, they really they had nothing concrete because it kept changing. Like
Right. Right.
it's
Yes.
not like it was reoccurring all the time in the same place every day, and so that they can do their sort of scientific measurements and analysis. It was, it was happening in different ways and to different people, and sometimes actually following them home.
Right. And
They,
obviously, what happened originally with the family before they, when they first started having their experiences, which was like when you hear what they went through, it's like, wow. They weren't out there. They're ranchers. They're not walking around
yeah,
with camera trying to capture evidence. They can't figure out what's going on. But it was very
yeah,
unusual what was going on there on that piece of land.
and apparently even before with the Navajo people that had sort of investigated themselves and said that there was just something really unholy or something wrong with that area or that placement of land, or that something there is very, it's not happy. Obviously, there's a lot of negative experiences that people are having there. So, but that's just one more example of that sort of tricksterish like thing. It's like as well with the ghost hunting shows. They do go out to very real locations, but a lot of the stuff that you're seeing obviously is not happening as it's being portrayed. It's
Yeah.
because it's not like you can a ghost is going to be like a trained seal and you just do what you tell it to do, right? Or a dog.
Exactly. Exactly.
So there is that element of trickery there, even though it is a real haunted location. Even though some of the information may be correct and true, you have to look at it because there's that entertainment aspect to it
Sure.
that is of course blends in with the idea of trickery or entertainment or sort of um,
Right. We just like we spent all this time there. And we got you show us running around, is talking to thin air, and nothing happens. It's like, oh, that's the end of that show.
Yeah, yeah. So it's why I always like them as travel logs more than anything because they do go to these places that are very
Mm,
interesting. That, you know,
right.
many of us will never have the chance to go to. But at the same point, you can't expect that something is going to happen on cue. It just doesn't work that way. You know, it's
Yeah.
very spontaneous and when you're least expecting.
Well, it's one of those things where, again, um, anybody that's ever worked in this field for any length of time realizes that the chances, sometimes you're lucky. I'm not going to say there's people sometimes that go there the first time, the first occasion, and they actually experience something. That happens. But sometimes, as a matter of fact, I say in a lot of these, just let's say on a historical site, I say usually the best people that have actual true experiences are either the docents or the tour guides or the people that go there day after day for an extended period of time.
Yeah,
They are the ones that really truly have a long list of stories. If they haven't seen it, they've heard it, sensations, because you could go days, sometimes and months, and nothing really happens.
yeah,
And then something does. Or sometimes things happen very early. Or very late. It's almost like whatever is there is shying away from a lot of human traffic.
yes.
And it's almost like wants to disappear, for lack of a better word, while a bunch of people are running around trying to capture evidence or just walking around, even if it's a tour. Uh, Going back to some of these shows, that it's almost like, yeah, I'm not going to say they don't capture stuff, but sometimes it's like they're too lucky as far as being able to capture as much as they do the one time or the days that they're there. It's just
Well,
doesn't work that
exactly.
way.
And it's hard too when you know if you've been on like a television set or a film shoot or whatever and you've got lights and you have equipment and you have this and you have
Sure.
it's not like like the security guard who's sitting alone and after hours in these places and it's dead quiet and nobody's
Yes.
around and they can be very observant. You're far more likely after the lights go down and people go away if you're by yourself hear the extra
Yes.
stuff, maybe footsteps that are disembodied, or hear
Mm-hmm.
sound, or see something out of your corner of your eye that turns around to be something you can't explain. Whereas in a crowd, I mean, it could be happening in the crowd, but we're distracted. We wouldn't know because there's just too much else going on. We're not in tune in that sort of zone. I find when I've had sort of psychic intuitions or experiences, or I have seen apparitions before, if I'm in a sort of mental zone that I wouldn't say normally be if I'm just doing my daily grocery shopping or whatever, where I'm sort of in that forefront of mind and
Yeah.
consciousness, where I'm concentrating in this physical world, doing my day to day business, versus sort of being in a location that has that ambiance and I'm sort of in tune with it. When I am, that's when I find that I have something happen versus everyday sort of life or even trying like I've been on many ghost vigils and just the idea and the excitement of being somewhere haunted and that and then it's always like I said it's at the end of the vigil when equipment's being packed away and you're joking around saying oh it was great to be here blah 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 or
Yeah.
gossiping or what and then something happens and you're like holy shit like,
Oh, let me tell you something. I've been on investigations where we don't. I would say let's meet at there's a when we were coming in here there's a gas station in the corner. Let's not talk here in front of the client's house. They don't, a lot of time people don't want anybody to know that they're doing this. So I would say
oh fuck,
or there's a Burger King. Let's just be in the park, whatever. And we would do like a real quick meeting there. It's like, hey, what did you think? Whatever. This was before you had a chance to look at any of the stuff. And you wouldn't be surprised when we would be standing around there how many times we would get weird stuff happening around us
yeah,
right after. Like I said, it was usually a short distance away from where we had been at.
yeah,
And I was the first one that I would sage down my car because I didn't want hitchhikers. And I tell them, a lot of times, everybody's always thinking about, if let's say if there was any type of entity or anything there to begin with, whatever, let's I go, sometimes the very act that you've got a group of people, some of them possibly sensitive, that you're out there either trying to do spirit communication or you're just there looking for it, you are going to bring in other entities which are not bound but which are desperate to make communication somehow
yes
to
that's a
hang out.
possibility It's definitely
And yeah,
possible.
sometimes it's like, yeah, or you might have got to a place that really does not have any type of paranormal activity, or if it is, it's residual. But you've collected a couple of them that are like, oh my God, hey, I think they can see us or hear us, or they want to talk to us. And a lot of times we had some really weird experiences right after we got out of there that we would look at each other like shadows. We would see shadows, hear stuff. Uh, we would hear, depending, especially if it was later at night, when everything is quieted down, we would hear like a far off, like, some people talking, but when you can't make out it, we'd look at each other and then we'd look and there's nobody there. Like, okay, if you look around that bush where you would think just like, so what was it that you heard? And a lot of times we would be talking amongst ourselves and then we'd all quiet down like, hey, who are those people talking?
Yeah.
And then we'd look around and look everywhere. There's nobody around us,
Oh wow,
you
that is
know,
chill.
and
That's
it's like,
giving me a chill. I've actually just listening to you, I've gotten a little chill from
yeah.
that. Yeah,
And
it is. I
it's,
had experiences like that as well with two ladies that I investigated a ghost road. It was a spook lights, but we did have many other sort of strange experiences on that ghost road, including things like that, like where we would be talking amongst ourselves, and then in the distance, the sort of lights that were not the spook light, but something else, or they, hearing whispering or things that just really where you kind of know that it doesn't, it's something else. It's otherworldly. It's not this sort of normal reality, day to day reality we're living in. It's something else.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
this is in and I that's one of the things that I want to say that a lot of times they really don't identify a lot in some of these shows, which is where you do sometimes have interaction from entities or discarnates, which have nothing whatsoever to do with the place they're at. Nothing. They're just
Yeah.
so desperate for acknowledgement or communication or whatever that
Yeah.
they just show up like, yeah, here I am. Um,
That's the thing, right? If you look so far into the abyss, that you'll start looking back at you, and
yes.
it may not be what you're expecting it to be,
Oh,
or
absolutely not.
you
Absolutely
think
not.
something completely different. So that's the thing too. Like, one of the things I do because part of my own spirituality now is I try to do the cleansing of myself. I try to ground myself after doing these types of studies, even just studying them and try to take many breaks so that I'm just not fully becoming obsessed into them. I think that's important as well. For people that are pursuing these things, is to take those breaks away from it because if you get too involved, like you said,
Yes.
you don't know.
Yes.
The skinwalker
Right.
people,
And
some of them
and a
claim,
lot of people don't realize that
yeah,
this work, if you get into this, like I said, even if you go to a place that when you get there, like I said, there's nothing there. There just isn't. It's either they've got an animal trap, the wind, the vent, whatever. Some don't even have residual. I told everybody, and I've been doing this for a really long time. I said sometimes I knew when I was going to get a case. Why? I had my office in like I had like a detached garage which I had converted to like an office, and one of the windows was that frosted glass. A lot of times I would sit there, especially later on, because it was just quieter and I was working on stuff. And sometimes I would see shadows move back and forth. And by the way, the other side of this frosted glass was like a little cement paved way. I had my trash cans there. In other words, nobody was walking around there. It wasn't on the street. It was towards the back side of my house. And I got to the point where I realized if I saw a couple of shadows flicking back and forth, I knew that within the most a week, we were going to get contacted for a case. And as a matter of fact, that was my first tip off that there was something there having to do as far as an intelligent haunting with that case. In other words, it doesn't work on that straight time linear stuff that we're so accustomed to.
yes,
Um,
it's precognitive almost. And
yes,
this
yes,
happens to UFOs as well.
yes,
And historical UFOs, like I immediately started thinking about the Swedish rockets case, where people were describing Swedish rockets as UFOs a few years before the rockets were actually invented and operational. It's the same with sort of the airships that people were describing in Texas and that were
okay,
where the actual airships were flying. So it's almost as if there's a precognition, like a non-linear sort of time frame. And it is the same, I think, with ghosts as well. It's not bound, they are not bound by the same space time that we are. You know?
Right. The way we look at it, that, like the hours, days, whatever, and one day follows the other. It's like sometimes they, especially, you know, in another
Yeah.
dimension, we're thinking, I mean, this is all like I have no idea. But yeah, a lot of things like that. And you're absolutely right. When you do this type of work, you have got to have very strong boundaries between that work and your regular life, because if not, you can run into some real big problems, more than sometimes people suspect, especially in this age of reality TV where everybody's like, oh my God, that's so exciting. And it's like, yeah, it is sometimes, but you got to be really careful at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And it is that thrill that is I think what drives a lot of us, because it is fun. It is fascinating.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you make it your entire being, then people do start, it starts to break down people's psyche. People
Yes.
getting divorced, people
Oh,
end up losing their
yes.
homes, people lose their jobs, they go on to form cults or whatever. But I mean, that's the thing. It's important, I think, that people realize that they need to reorient themselves, or at least
Yes.
ground. I like to use the term ground away from, and I usually know when I'm starting to get to a certain point, and then I just walk away and I have to go shopping for shoes or something.
Right, exactly. When the
You're the
guitar going
funny
gets tough,
thing.
the tough go shopping. Let me tell you
Yes,
something.
you
That's a
have to
great.
be a normal person, right? You have to be a normal for
Oh,
people.
absolutely. And I tell her, and I say, because of course, I mean, cultures, everybody has a different say, but a lot of the old, these sometimes some cultures still have it. When somebody died, and I go, there's a reason for it, where either one, you were prohibited from speaking about that person for X amount of time or mentioning their name. They
Yeah.
would burn their things. I mean, and if you look at it, basically, they were ghost busting. They were
Yes.
afraid of this ghost of this family member coming back. So they, you couldn't even talk about that person. You couldn't keep any of their belongings. This was, what they were trying to do was, in case you decide to come back, we're going to try very hard for you not to come back.
Yes. Sort of,
And
and that's kind of the thing with feng shui too. Is like, if
yes,
you're moving into a home and you suspect it's haunted, you may want to put the bed in the non-logical position in the room, or not where it would have been for traditionally, or move chairs about or whatever, because you want to sort of disorient the ghost, or that sort of
yes,
line of thinking. So
right, which
and
is
there's something to it. There is something to it.
right, and I mean, and we could go into, why would they bury criminals and hangings and gibbets at the crossroads so that the spirits of these murderers would not be able to follow anybody home. Besides the fact that you were being buried on unconsecrated ground, that back when that was allowed, that was like, oh, that's bad. But
Yeah.
the idea was not to have the spirit or the ghost of this murderer be able to follow anybody home. And I mean, there's crossroads magic. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, you know, whether it's accurate or not, but yeah, it's almost like you said, a way of tricking this spirit to kind of lose track of you.
Yeah, and well, then there's a lot of folklore too that shows ghosts appearing at crossroads, but also actual UFOs, of course. The UFOs appear at sort of a crossroads, or these sort of liminal spaces between, say, like a river and a mountain, or well, places like that are in between. They're in between almost this world and another world. They're in an in between space, like a window or a doorway, or things that
Right.
cross and stairways and hallways. It's not often you see them, like, as being reported as just sitting on the sofa. They're
Yes.
usually somewhere in a very liminal space, and in a liminal frame of mind. Like the idea of renovations and stuff like that, provoking sort of those things in the houses in between states. So and that's why I recommended the trickster, the paranormal, and
Yeah, I'm gonna look that up. Absolutely.
yeah, I
And that
it's
makes a
right.
lot of sense. Within anybody that's actually done this, worked in
Yeah,
this, you've come across that more than once where you go, God, it's like, man, who's having a laugh at my expense?
exactly.
But anyway, Sue, I wanted to thank you so very much for spending this time tonight. It has been absolutely fascinating to speak to you. And for my podcast listeners, if you could give out your website address.
Oh, absolutely. If people want to find me and they can sort of snoop through my little online cupboard here, my website is called Out of My Mind's Eye. And yeah,
Okay.
and it's supposed to be cheeky. And it is Susan St. Clair, so SUSANSTCLAIR.com. And
And
I have YouTube. I have a whole bunch of goodies and things that I'm working on and stuff. So there's a little bit for everybody in there, from
per-
magical studies to UFOs to parapsychology. So
perfect. I'll make sure to also include a link to directly to your website on the credits of the show. But again, thank you so very much. It has been absolutely fascinating to speak to you.
thank you and have a good night.
Good night. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.
So what'd you think? What? Let me tell you something. See, this is why I like talking to people because there's always that people have that different angle, that trickster aspect. I'm gonna get that book. I'm gonna get that book, and I want to talk about it in another show once I read up on it because it, it resonates. It resonates. Like I said, when you've done this work for a while and you've had enough experiences or stuff happens that when it happens once, you're like, oh, okay, well, man, you kind of, but when you start doing this a while and certain things happen and the timing on it is like, are you kidding me? You realize, okay, this is not happenstance. This is not coincidentally that this didn't work out in my favor. Like they said, after I put everything away, or I'm driving away. It's like there's too much of an intelligence, for lack of a better word, as to the timing on it. And it's almost like ha ha ha, exactly like what she said, like a trickster or somebody wanting to have the last laugh, or just when you're thinking, oh, you know what, there's nothing here and I didn't pick up anything, nobody even got even a goose pimple on their stuff. Like, that's it, nothing happened. Which, by the way, when you do this enough times, you know that's not really an arbiter of nothing there, because like I said, you could go sometimes and nothing happens, doesn't mean nothing's there. But let's say you go there and nothing happens, so you're, let's face it, we're human beings, so you're already going in the direction of like, okay, let's see. But anyway, but you don't have nothing to show for the time you spent there. No weird feelings, no difference in temperatures, nothing caught on cameras or film, or if you have any EVP. Sometimes you don't have time really to review them while you're there, but still, sometimes you go to places and I mean, you go into the front door and it hits you like a, and then right after you've put everything away and you're ready to leave, I've had this experience where all of a sudden you're hearing footsteps upstairs and there's nobody upstairs. And everybody like looks at each other and it's like, okay, you heard that. You're about the only thing you have is, did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. I heard that too. And it's like, oh, nothing, you know, nothing at all. And sometimes this will coincide with what the people that are living there have described that's happened. Um, I mean, there's the same thing. Like I had said, you know, uh, usually when we had a team show up in separate cars, which a lot of people do, it's bad manners, and really, you didn't want to have a group of people standing outside the front of your house discussing what they thought was there or didn't. So, most of the time we would meet like at a nearby parking lot somewhere that we could just stop a minute and just kind of like talk about things that sometimes you just can't. Especially, I would say about 80% of the investigations that I did, the homeowners were there. Okay, this is on residential investigations. The homeowners were there, and as a matter of fact, we encouraged it. About the only times that we said, if they had pets or anything, is like, can you take them out for maybe a few hours so that we don't get weird noises in here and really it's your pet. But besides that, um, or if there was really young children, also we would ask them if they could let's like take them, maybe with a grandparent or something for a little bit. So we encourage the homeowners to be there. And like I said, it's in bad manners to sit outside of somebody's house and have this discussion. And basically, it's just you sit there and you go, "What did you think? What did you think? What did happen to you?" And and believe it or not, after during the 30 years, it wouldn't be the first time. A lot of times you end a lot of not all the time, but especially if it was on the weekend, or you would end up some of these things maybe 11 or 12. Let's say somebody worked, so they asked you to come by early because that's the only time they could be there, so you had to leave by the time it's been. Point being, also depending where we were at, it was pretty quiet. When you rolled into some parking lot, there was hardly anybody around, so you just step out of your car and you would talk. And by the way, you develop some really good memories also when you work in a paranormal team along those lines. But you'd be surprised how many times we had really weird stuff happen to us right then and there. And a lot of times it was stuff that was around us. And let me give you an example. We had times where we had like a cacophony of dogs start howling out of nowhere. There was no siren go off, like no police, no fire department, that some dogs will start howling, nothing like that. All of a sudden, these dogs start howling and it's not like once, twice, and it's over. It was like, it's so much that you're talking, everybody just stops and looks at each other like, why are they howling? Why are they howling? Not barking, howling like that. What is going on? And it was very disquieting. As a matter of fact, that happened to me like twice. It's different investigations. Same thing, like I said, where all of a sudden you're hearing people talking and you're realizing, wait a minute. And you're like, man, is somebody over here? Almost like you're thinking, is on the other side of that bush or the other side of the building. And there's nobody there. And it's conversation like what a lot of people describe, where you can't exactly make out what's being said. And to be honest with you, at the beginning, when you're having a conversation in your group, you're not paying attention to that. You're like, and then all of a sudden, when it intrudes on your reality, and you're like, who is that? What? And then it's like, there's nothing there. And, every once in a while, we would have stuff shift around inside of cars, stuff that shouldn't have shifted, especially because the car is not moving. It's like it's been stopped for quite a while, stuff shifting around, and like equipment wise. I've had people that have had like stuffed animals. When they had that time of the Beanie Babies, there was this one investigator. She had Beanie Babies in her car. I don't know if she kept. I think she kept some on her on her dashboard. She got a couple of the Beanie Babies thrown around inside her vehicle when we had been talking maybe like 15 minutes. The car wasn't moving, wasn't even turned on. She had no AC, nothing. And it was like, I remember that we were like all getting in our cars, and all of a sudden she comes and she goes, "You guys are gonna believe this." And we're like, "What? What is it? What is it?" She goes, "Come here." We're like, "What? We were like, what is it? What is it?" And she's like, "Look." And we're like, "What?" She goes, "Those things were on my dashboard." There was something like she knew that they had been shifted, they had been moved. Other times we have actually heard stuff from from outside the vehicle, stuff shifting and moving around inside vehicles. That's happened. Another time we did hear something kerplunk like inside somebody's trunk. Like, in other words, that there's no plausible reason why you're going to hear that noise. And like I said, this is more audible because it's later at night. Everything is quiet. There's not that much traffic. There's not a bunch of people streaming around. It's just quieter. And the reason why I point this out is, number one, the trickster thing that she pointed out. And number two, that when you do this, whether you're sensitive or not, which, by the way, my theory is that along the line you develop sensitivity even if you don't have it, you are going to draw in entities and discarnates that have maybe no tie whatsoever to the location or the case that you are there for. and they are desperate to be acknowledged, to make communication something. First of all, because you're reaching out. Number two, you might have more than one sensitive amongst you. A lot of times, depending on the circumstances, if you do have an active haunting at where you are at, they will hold back either because they're afraid or they're something is there that just doesn't let them enter. So they kind of hang out around the car, uh, like waiting for you to leave, and then that when you stop, then they. And I've said it before. I would smudge down all my vehicles, all the time, trunk, everything, and everybody like, oh, Marlene is like, oh, Marlene, nothing, because after a while, when you work with different teams, that some of us, I spoke to enough investigators that would tell me I brought somebody home with me, and I would say, well, just ignore it. And sure enough, if 9 times out of 10, if they didn't engage it, it would go away. But yeah, stuff would start happening at the house. And sometimes it was just somebody that didn't want to. I want to say this is where you tread a fine line as an investigator. Part of you wants to, you think, what if this is somebody that's confused, a human soul that's lost, maybe just not sure they're dead, just can't figure out why nobody talks to them, nobody seems to see them or hear them. Maybe they just need somebody to like push them in the right direction and tell them you're dead. You always kind of have, at least me, on the bleeding heart when it comes to that. But based on my experience, you always have to be careful, because once you, especially when it's something that's already come home with you, when you start engaging in any type of dialogue or communication, I hate to say it, and I know some people will say, nah, but yeah, it's almost like you're giving an invite. You're acknowledging, okay? The truth is, you really don't know what that entity is, who that entity is. You don't know, is it truly a human soul that's lost and confused and maybe needs a helping hand to find its way? Or is it something else? And once you open those lines of communication, even whatever your best intention might be to say to this soul, you're dead, be on your way, whatever, it could take on a life of its own, and you might have an entity that for some reason says, I want to stay here. Or it might be more malevolent than that. I mean, it opens, it's a big question mark. And, you know, my experience with that was like, ignore them. And believe me, it was times that I was tempted to like want to start a dialogue, even if it's to tell them you're dead. But when it, like I said, I always had very, very strict boundaries between my home, my space, my sacred space, my home, whatever, and any time that I did an investigation, especially after I would come back. I would come back, which is, I don't engage with you, I don't talk to you, even if I feel you around me, because whatever, I'm not. I'm gonna just ignore you. And believe it or not, that works. That works. After 2 or 3 days, it just dissipates. It goes on its way, whatever it was. And that's that. So anyway, guys, I hope you like this show. I know I love speaking to Sue. Again, I will have a link for her website on the credits of the show. Make sure to go to miamighostchronicles.com. There you have links for the videos on the internet, on YouTube. You have links to listen or download the actual MP3 files for the podcast. I also have links to different podcast platforms, depending, if you have iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. I have a link there that will take you directly to where our shows are held on that platform. If you want to do that, so you could download whatever podcasts you want and, listen to them, at your, maybe you're going to be someplace where you don't have a Wi-Fi connection or something, and you want to download those MP3 files. You can do it from miamighostchronicles.com. Again, if you have a story, anything, an experience, contact me at Marlene at miamighostchronicles.com. I also have a submit your story tab there at MiamiGhostChronicles.com by all means. Also, if you go to storiesofthesupernatural.info, I also have links there to the shows and the podcast, and also I'm going to be putting out more information about the book that I'm coming out with probably at the end of this year, which is 2018, which is it's tentatively titled Supernatural Safety. And it's basically along the lines of what you should do, a DIY. And I'm going to throw in there some caveats when it's like, this is not a DIY, job. And I'm sure all of you maybe have had that experience if you have where you live at that, there's some things that you could DIY and there's stuff that like don't, you're either going to ruin the plumbing, you're going to electrocute yourself. I'll make mention, but there's a lot of things that I tell people what to do as far as when moving from to a place. What happens? What if you suspect? What if you pick up something? And what you can do on your level before you need to bring in a paranormal team. And I also kind of tell you when it is like, hey, stop it right there and get somebody in there to help you. But I'll tell you more about the book. I'm working on it, so I'm one busy bee. So again, guys, thank you so very, very much for being part of my audience. I have a lot of excellent and fantastic and interesting guests lined up, so I hope you come back every week and we can share this time together. Take care.